Why is Confucius on the U.S. Supreme Court? There is a Chinese teacher carved into the stone of the United States Supreme Court. Not a president, not a diplomat, not a general, not a modern political figure. Confucius. The first time I learned this, I paused for a moment. Because for many Chinese people, Confucius feels almost too familiar. So familiar that we may stop really seeing him. We hear the name Confucius and we think of school, exams, memorization, a sentence from the Analects written on a blackboard. Maybe even a teacher saying, "This will be on the test." And yet, there he is, on the United States Supreme Court. And he is not alone. Beside him are Moses and Solon, a teacher from ancient China, a lawgiver from the Hebrew tradition, a statesman from ancient Greece. Three figures from three different civilizations placed together on the east pediment of one of America's most important legal buildings. This is not a legend. It is not an internet rumor. And it is not a little piece of national pride dressed up as history. He is really there. If Momo were sitting beside me, he would probably blink very slowly and say, "So, does the Supreme Court secretly assign homework from the Analects?" Cloud would look at him calmly and say, "Maybe not homework, but they did put him in stone." Hello, I'm Lynn. Lynn as in forest. Tonight, we are talking about a question that sounds small at first, but opens into something much larger. Why would a Chinese teacher from more than 2,500 years ago appear on the U.S. Supreme Court? The interesting answer is not simply, because Confucius was great. That is too easy. It is also not simply, because America recognized Chinese wisdom. That makes the story smaller than it really is. The more interesting question is this. When a nation builds one of its most important legal buildings, why would it include a thinker from a distant civilization? What is it trying to say about law? And maybe more importantly, what is law actually for? Is law only a set of rules? Or does every legal system also depend on the kind of human beings who live under it? On the west side of the Supreme Court building, many people know the famous words, "Equal justice under law." But on the east side, there is another inscription, "Justice the guardian of liberty." And on that eastern pediment, Confucius appears with Moses and Solon. That is fascinating, because Confucius was not a lawmaker in the modern sense. He did not write a constitution. He did not build a court system. He did not sit in a black robe and strike a gavel. So if someone says, "See, American law actually comes from Confucius," that is not accurate. American law grew mainly from English common law, constitutional history, Enlightenment thought, Roman legal influence, religious and political debate, and America's own complicated historical experience. Confucius did not secretly write the Constitution, but that is exactly where the story becomes more interesting. Confucius is not on the Supreme Court because he gave America a legal code. He is there because he represents a deeper question behind law. What kind of people can live together under rules? How should power be restrained? How should human beings be educated before they are trusted with freedom, authority, or judgment? And how can a society depend on more than punishment to hold itself together? That is where Confucius truly enters the story. For many people with a Chinese background, Confucius can feel heavy. He can sound like school, like rules, like hierarchy, like old family expectations, like someone at the dinner table telling everyone to sit properly, speak properly, and stop asking uncomfortable questions. And to be fair, history did make him heavy. Over many centuries, Confucius became more than one person. He became part of an educational system, a political language, a moral vocabulary, a family structure, a long imagination of what a good person and a good society should be. When an idea lives inside history for too long, it gathers weight. It gets interpreted, institutionalized, simplified, used, misused, sometimes even turned into pressure. So we do not need to pretend that Confucius is a perfect answer. He is not. Confucian traditions have had rigid and painful sides. Some parts need to be questioned. Some parts need to be reinterpreted. Some parts need to be left behind. But an idea can be misused and still contain wisdom. And the most moving part of Confucius is not that he told people to obey. It is that he kept asking a very plain, very difficult question. Can a human being become better? Not just smarter, not just more successful, not just more persuasive, not just better at winning arguments, but more humane, more restrained, more aware of others, more capable of shame, more capable of kindness, more capable of seeing another person as fully human. That question is ancient, but it is also painfully modern. We have faster technology than ever, faster messages, faster opinions, faster outrage, faster ways to misunderstand people we have never met. A person can dislike a stranger in 3 seconds, share an opinion in 5 seconds, condemn an entire group of people in 10. We are much faster than the ancients, but are we better at living together? That is not so clear. Confucius cared deeply about that problem. What happens when human beings become clever without becoming humane? What happens when a society has ambition but not virtue? Freedom but no self-restraint? Law but no inner sense of responsibility? Of course, law matters. We do not need to romanticize this. Without law, the weak are not protected. Without institutions, power becomes arbitrary. Without procedure, justice can turn into emotion. Without rights, human dignity depends too much on the mood of the powerful. But law alone is not enough. Law can tell us, do not cross this line, but it cannot by itself make us kind. Law can punish cruelty, but it cannot practice patience for us every morning. It cannot pause our anger. It cannot soften our contempt. It cannot teach us, day after day, to see another person as more than an obstacle. Law protects the bottom line, but a civilization is not judged only by the line at the bottom. It is also judged by what it teaches people to become. That may be the subtle relationship between Confucius and law. Confucius is not there to replace law. He is there, perhaps, to remind law of something simple. Law is not dealing with machines. It is dealing with human beings. And human beings need formation. They need education, ritual, responsibility, good examples, moral imagination, and the daily practice of making the world a little less harsh. Cloud might say, "The hardest part of wisdom is not understanding it. It is repeating it quietly in ordinary life." Momo might add, for example, not biting your roommate when you are hungry, which, honestly, is also a form of civilization. What makes this story even more interesting is that Confucius did not suddenly appear in the American imagination only when the Supreme Court building was constructed. Long before airplanes, long before the internet, long before anyone could search Confucius quotes while standing in line for coffee, some early American thinkers had already encountered Chinese moral philosophy through European translations. Benjamin Franklin is one of the most interesting examples. Franklin was a printer, inventor, writer, diplomat, and later one of the important figures of the American founding generation. We tend to imagine the 18th century as a slow world. No planes, no phones, no social media, no instant translation, no recommendation algorithm quietly deciding what you should believe next. Momo would probably ask, so how did they even learn about Confucius? Carrier pigeon? Almost. Books, ships, translations, printers, curiosity. That was the algorithm. In the 18th century, Franklin published excerpts related to the moral teachings of Confucius in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. That is a quietly astonishing fact. At that time, China was very far away from colonial North America. And yet, a printer in Philadelphia was reading the words of an ancient Chinese teacher and deciding that his readers might find something useful there. Not because Confucius was exotic, not because he made a good decoration, but because he spoke to a practical question Franklin cared about. How does a person cultivate virtue? How does a society encourage moral character? How does a leader govern the self before trying to govern others? That concern feels very Franklin, and it also feels deeply Confucian. Franklin's famous interest in self-improvement was not about looking inspirational. It was about practice. Watch your habits, use your time, control your temper, improve your mind, serve the public. Do not merely speak well, live well. Confucian self-cultivation has a similar patience. It is not a story of one dramatic awakening after which everything becomes easy. It is slower than that, more ordinary, more difficult. It is the daily work of becoming slightly less selfish, slightly less careless, slightly less cruel, slightly more able to pause before harming someone. It is not glamorous, but many of the things that hold civilization together are not glamorous. Education is not glamorous. Self-restraint is not glamorous. Responsibility is not glamorous. Mercy is not glamorous. Refusing to turn every disagreement into a war is not glamorous. But it is precious, because without those things, a society becomes louder, harsher, and harder to live in. So, when we see Confucius on the Supreme Court, the point is not to say, East defeated West, or America finally recognized Chinese greatness. That would make the story smaller than it is. The more beautiful point is this: Human civilizations have been asking some of the same questions for a very long time. China asked them. The Hebrew tradition asked them. Ancient Greece asked them. The American founding generation asked them. And we are still asking them now. What is justice? What is freedom? How should power be restrained? How should people be educated? How can a society have order without losing compassion? Can different civilizations do more than compete? Can they also learn from one another? No single civilization has answered all of this. Not China, not America, not Greece, not the ancient world, not the modern one. Every civilization has seen the mountain from one side. Maybe humility begins when we admit our view matters, but it is not the whole mountain. Today, we often hear about China and America through the language of rivalry, competition, suspicion, strategy, threat, power. Those things are real, but they are not the whole story. If we only look at them, we forget another quieter history. A history of people reading books from far away. A history of translation. A history of strange ideas crossing oceans. A history of distant people recognizing something useful in one another. A printer in Philadelphia reading Confucius. A sculptor in Washington placing Confucius beside Moses and Solon. And a viewer, many years later, looking up and asking, why is he there? Confucius did not travel to the Supreme Court by conquest. He did not arrive by army, or by empire, or by advertising, and definitely not by going viral. He traveled by books, by translators, by teachers, by printers, by curious minds, by the human suspicion that our own civilization may not contain every answer. That may be the gentlest part of the story. The deepest things in civilization are not always loud. Sometimes they are quiet. A face carved in stone. A few lines in an old newspaper. A thought carried across an ocean. A little moonlight on dark water. And really, which side owns the moon? It shines on the waters of China. It shines on American rivers. It shone on the books of the ancients. And it still shines on people today, tired from ordinary life, trying in small ways to become better. Momo might stretch and say, so Confucius had excellent international distribution. Yes, Momo, very slow distribution, but very durable. He traveled through books, through memory, through the rare moments when civilizations lower their pride and look at one another with curiosity. So, why is Confucius on the U.S. Supreme Court? Maybe there is no one-sentence answer. He is not there because American law came from Confucius. Of course not. He is not there to prove that one civilization is greater than another. The story matters because it reminds us that law does not grow out of emptiness. Justice needs rules. But it also needs human beings capable of judgment. Freedom needs rights. But it also needs self-restraint. Education should form not only careers, but character. And different civilizations are not connected only by competition and misunderstanding. They are also connected by reading, borrowing, respecting, slowly understanding, and sometimes admitting, my world does not contain every answer. Maybe a hopeful world is not built by every civilization closing its doors and declaring itself complete. Maybe it is built when we are still willing to learn, from our own traditions, from other traditions, from the old, from the new, from our failures, and sometimes from people very far away. Thank you for sitting with me by the misty lake tonight. May we keep a little quiet judgment in a noisy world, a little patience in a very fast age. And between different civilizations, may we see not only conflict and difference, but also the light they have offered one another.